At 74, Amna stood in her modest kitchen, watching the sunrise paint golden streaks across her window. Her daughter Maria had called again yesterday, voice heavy with concern about her living alone. "Mama, you're getting older," Maria had said, the words hanging between them like morning mist. "Maybe it's time to think about other arrangements." Other arrangements. The phrase echoed in Amna's mind as she reached for her favorite ceramic mug, the one Ahmad, her late husband, had brought back from their honeymoon trip to the mountains 30 years ago. Her fingers, still steady despite the arthritis that had begun whispering its presence, wrapped around the warm porcelain. This morning ritual, like so many others, had become a small act of defiance against time itself. But here's what Maria didn't know, what none of her well-meaning children understood. Amna had a secret. One simple practice that had transformed not just her body, but her entire relationship with aging. It wasn't expensive equipment or complicated routines that filled her day. It was something so beautifully uncomplicated that most people her age dismissed it entirely. Senior empowerment isn't about proving you're 20 again, Amna had learned to tell herself each morning. It's about honoring who you are right now, in this moment, in this body that has carried you through 7 decades of living. The truth about life after 60 had revealed itself to her gradually, like photographs developing in her old darkroom. Age wasn't the enemy she'd been taught to fear. Her body wasn't betraying her. It was simply asking for different kinds of attention, gentler conversations, more intentional movement. The emotional wisdom that came with her years had taught her something profound. Strength wasn't about lifting the heaviest weights or running the fastest miles. Real strength was about consistency, about showing up for yourself when the world suggested you should start stepping back. 3 months ago, Amna had made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of accepting the gradual decline that seemed inevitable, she chose to explore what her body could still do. Not with the aggressive determination of her younger years, but with the patient curiosity that comes with emotional maturity. She discovered that independent living wasn't just about managing daily tasks. It was about nurturing the relationship between her mind, body, and spirit. Her neighbor Asifa, 2 years older and dealing with her own health challenges, had initially been skeptical. At our age, shouldn't we be taking it easy? She'd asked during one of their evening walks. But Amna had learned something that changed everything. Taking it easy and giving up weren't the same thing. The gentle exercises she discovered weren't about turning back time. They were about moving forward with grace, strength, and dignity. Now, as she finished her morning tea and prepared for her daily routine, Amna smiled at her reflection in the hallway mirror. Her face showed the beautiful map of her years, laugh lines from raising 3 children, worry lines from the challenges that life had brought, wisdom lines from all the lessons learned along the way. But her eyes held something new, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there 6 months ago. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Maria's name appeared on the caller ID, and Amna could already imagine the conversation that was coming. Her daughter meant well, but she was about to discover something that would challenge everything she thought she knew about aging, strength, and what it truly means to live independently at 74. Amna reached for the phone, knowing that today's conversation would be different. Today, she had something to show her daughter that might just change both of their lives forever. The weight of yesterday's dreams. "Hello, Beta," Amna answered, settling into Ahmed's old reading chair by the window. The leather had worn soft over the years, molded to the shape of countless evening conversations and quiet moments of reflection. "Mama, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday," Maria began, her voice carrying that familiar blend of love and worry that had become the soundtrack of their recent calls. "Ollie and I looked at that assisted living place I mentioned. It's really nice, and they have activities." Amna closed her eyes, remembering when she'd been the one making such calls about her own mother. Life after retirement had taught her many lessons, but perhaps the most profound was understanding how the roles slowly shifted between generations. She'd spent 42 years teaching high school mathematics, finding purpose in guiding young minds through complex equations. Now, 6 years into retirement, She was still learning what it meant to be guided rather than guiding. "Maria, do you remember when your father first started having his heart troubles?" Amna asked gently, steering the conversation toward a memory that had been surfacing more frequently lately. There was a pause. "Of course, Mama. That was difficult for all of us." Ahmad had been 68 when the doctors delivered their verdict. His heart was wearing out, they said, like an old engine that needed gentler treatment. For 3 years, Amna had watched the man who once carried her across puddles and lifted their children to pick apples slowly adapt to a smaller world. She learned about senior reflection in those quiet hospital corridors, understanding for the first time how quickly independence could slip away. "He used to sit right here in this chair," Amna continued, running her hand along the armrest, "and tell me about all the things he wished he'd done differently. Not big regrets, you understand. Little ones. He wished he'd danced more at our wedding. Wished he'd taken that pottery class I'd suggested. Wished he'd learned to swim properly instead of just pretending he could." What Maria didn't know was how those conversations had planted something deep in Amna's heart. After Ahmed's passing 2 years ago, she found herself sitting in this same chair, making her own list of wishes. But instead of dwelling on regrets, she decided to ask a different question. What could she still do? What dreams were still within reach? Finding purpose after decades of structured work schedules and shared responsibilities had been like learning a new language. The first year of widowhood had been about survival, managing finances, maintaining the house, navigating the strange silence that filled rooms once alive with Ahmed's gentle humming. But the second year had brought something unexpected, a curiosity about who she was beyond wife, mother, and teacher. "The thing is, Beta," Amna said, watching a cardinal land on the bird feeder Ahmad had built, "your father's regrets weren't really about the things he didn't do. They were about the person he stopped believing he could be." That realization had changed everything. At 72, Amna had made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She'd started saying yes to invitations she would have declined. She joined Asifa for those evening walks that gradually became longer and more adventurous. She'd even signed up for the community center's gentle yoga class, despite never having been flexible enough to touch her toes. But it was 3 months ago when everything truly shifted. Dr. Hassan, during her routine checkup, had mentioned her bone density results with concern. "We need to discuss prevention," he'd said, the word hanging heavy between them. Prevention of falls, of fractures, of the gradual weakening that seemed inevitable. That night, alone in Ahmed's chair, Amna had experienced what she could only call emotional resilience awakening within her. She'd felt something she hadn't experienced since her teaching days, the thrill of a challenge worth accepting. Not the reckless ambition of youth, but the steady determination that comes with understanding exactly what's at stake. "Mama, are you still there?" Maria's voice brought her back to the present moment. "Yes, Beta, I'm here, and there's something I need to show you." The unexpected discovery. The conversation with Maria ended with a promise. She would visit that weekend to see what her mother had been up to. After hanging up, Amna sat quietly, remembering the moment 3 months ago when everything had begun to change. It had started with a simple accident. She'd been reaching for Ahmed's old photo albums on the top shelf when her balance wavered. Nothing dramatic, just a moment of uncertainty that left her gripping the bookshelf, heart racing not from exertion, but from the sudden awareness of her own vulnerability. That night, she'd lain awake thinking about all the women she'd known who'd had the fall, that pivotal moment that changed everything. The next morning, instead of accepting this new limitation, something in Amna had quietly rebelled. She'd found herself researching something she'd never considered before, what her body actually needed at this stage of life. Not what others assumed it needed, but what it was genuinely asking for. Senior reflection had taken on new meaning during those late-night internet searches. She discovered that strength wasn't something you inevitably lost with age. It was something you could choose to maintain, even rebuild with the right approach. The revelation had been both simple and profound. Her body wasn't broken. It had just been neglected in ways she'd never recognized. The first week had been humbling. Standing in her living room, attempting the gentlest of movements she'd found in her research, Amna had confronted the gap between who she remembered being and who she'd become. Her muscles protested exercises that would have been effortless decades earlier. Her balance, once reliable, now required conscious attention. But instead of discouragement, she'd felt something unexpected: curiosity. This wasn't about reclaiming her youth. That ship had sailed long ago, and she'd made peace with its departure. This was about discovering what version of herself was still possible. Finding purpose in this new chapter meant accepting both her limitations and her potential with equal grace. By the second week, something subtle but significant had shifted. The morning stiffness that had become her unwelcome companion began to ease. The energy that had been gradually draining from her days started to return in small but noticeable increments. Most surprisingly, the quiet confidence she'd carried in her teaching days, that inner knowing that she could handle whatever challenge arose, began to resurface. Asifa had been the first to notice. "You're walking differently," she'd observed during one of their evening strolls around the neighborhood. Taller somehow. It was true. The subtle slouch that had crept into Amna's posture over the years had begun to correct itself, not through force or rigid discipline, but through a gentle consistency that honored both her current abilities and her desire to maintain them. The real test had come last month when her grandson had visited with his two young children. In the past, playing with them had left her exhausted, her back aching from bending to their level. But this time, she'd been able to keep up with their energy, to lift them for hugs without wincing, to chase them around the backyard without feeling winded. "Nanny, you're strong," her 4-year-old granddaughter had declared, hanging from Amna's arms like a little monkey. The innocent observation had brought tears to Amna's eyes, not from sadness, but from the recognition of a truth she'd almost forgotten about herself. That evening, after the children had gone home, Amna had called her old friend from the teacher's lounge, Fatima, who was now struggling with her own aging challenges. "I think I found something," she'd said quietly. "Something that might help both of us." But it was the conversation with Dr. Hassan 2 weeks ago that had truly confirmed what Amna suspected. Her latest test showed improvements that surprised even her physician. "Whatever you're doing," he'd said, studying her results with genuine curiosity, "keep doing it." Now, as Saturday approached and Maria's visit drew near, Amna felt the familiar flutter of anticipation mixed with uncertainty. How do you explain to someone you love that you've discovered a different way of aging? How do you share the hope you've found without sounding like you're denying the realities of growing older? The answer, she knew, wouldn't be in words alone. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything feel possible. Amna was finishing her daily routine when she heard Maria's car in the driveway. But as she moved to greet her daughter, the doorbell rang with an unexpected urgency that made her pause. "Mama, there's someone here to see you," Maria called from the front door, her voice carrying a note of confusion that Amna hadn't heard in years. Standing on her doorstep, looking remarkably unchanged despite the passage of time, was Hassan. Not Dr. Hassan, her physician, but Hassan Malik, the man she'd once planned to marry before she met Ahmad 48 years ago. "Amna," he said softly, his eyes crinkling with the same warmth she remembered from their university days. "I hope you don't mind the surprise." Maria looked between them with growing bewilderment, clearly sensing the weight of history she couldn't quite grasp. "Mama, do you know this gentleman?" The moment stretched between them, heavy with the kind of significance that only comes when the past reaches across decades to touch the present. Hassan had been her first love, the engineering student who'd shared her dreams of making a difference in the world. Their relationship had ended not from lack of love, but from circumstances beyond their control. His family's move to Canada, her acceptance of the teaching position that would define her career, and the practical realities that young people sometimes mistake for destiny. Hassan moved back to town 6 months ago, he explained, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone who understands the delicacy of the moment. "I heard about Ahmed's passing through mutual friends. I wasn't sure if I should reach out, but then I saw you at the community center last week during the yoga class." The rediscovery, after 60, felt surreal. Here was a piece of her past she'd carefully tucked away, suddenly standing in her present with silver hair and laugh lines that spoke of a life fully lived. But what struck her most wasn't the romance of reunion movies. It was the practical reality of two people who'd both learned what it meant to love, lose, and continue living. I was hoping we could talk, Hassan continued, glancing at Maria with respectful acknowledgement. About old times, yes, but also about new beginnings. I've been thinking a lot about second chances lately. Maria's protective instincts were clearly awakening. Mama, maybe we should discuss this privately first. But Amna found herself studying Hassan with the same curiosity she'd brought to her physical transformation. This wasn't about replacing what she'd had with Ahmad. That love story was complete and beautiful in its own right. This was about recognizing that healing family bonds sometimes meant showing your children that life doesn't stop at 74, that the capacity for connection and growth doesn't diminish with age. Would you like some tea? Amna asked, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. Both of you. I think we all have some catching up to do. As they settled in the living room, Hassan in the chair opposite Ahmed's, Maria perched uncertainly on the sofa, Amna realized that this unexpected visit had elevated everything. The conversation she planned to have with Maria about her exercise routine suddenly seemed like just one part of a much larger story about what it meant to remain fully alive at any age. Before we talk about the past, Amna said, looking directly at Hassan, there's something I need to show both of you about who I am now, about what I've discovered is still possible. The stakes had just risen exponentially, but for the first time in years, Amna felt ready to meet them. What happened next surprised even Amna herself. Instead of feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of the moment, she experienced a profound sense of clarity that could only come with wisdom with age. She stood up from Ahmed's chair with a fluidity that made Maria blink in surprise and walked to the center of the room where the morning light streamed through the windows. For the past 3 months, Amna began, her voice steady and clear, I've been doing something that has changed not just my body, but my entire understanding of what it means to grow older. She looked directly at Maria, then at Hassan. But before I show you what that is, I need to tell you both something important. Maria leaned forward, her earlier defensiveness softening into genuine attention. Hassan remained quietly respectful, sensing that he was witnessing something significant. Maria, Beta, when you suggest assisted living, you're trying to protect me from falling. Hassan, when you talk about second chances, you're trying to protect both of us from disappointment. Amna's words carried the gentle authority of someone who had finally found her truth. But what if protection isn't what I need anymore? What if what I need is to show you that life's turning point after 60 doesn't have to be about limiting possibilities? Without another word, Amna began to demonstrate the simple movement routine that had transformed her life. It wasn't dramatic or impressive to watch. Gentle squats using the chair for support, careful arm circles, modified balance exercises, wall push-ups that honored her current strength while gradually building more. Each movement was deliberate, mindful, and adapted to her 74-year-old body. But something magical happened as she moved. The hesitant, careful woman who had been declining in small increments over recent years disappeared, replaced by someone who moved with quiet confidence and grace. Her posture straightened, her breathing deepened, and her movements flowed with the kind of natural rhythm that spoke of genuine strength rather than forced effort. This is what I do every single day, she said, completing her routine without breathlessness or strain. 5 simple exercises that take 15 minutes. Nothing complicated, nothing that requires equipment or expertise. Just consistent, gentle attention to what my body can do rather than what it can't. Maria stared at her mother with dawning realization. Mama, you look different, stronger. The emotional closure Amna had been seeking wasn't about choosing between her daughter's concern and her own independence. It wasn't about deciding whether Hassan's reappearance was welcome or disruptive. It was about demonstrating that she had become someone capable of holding multiple truths simultaneously. She could be grateful for love and concern while still claiming her right to define her own capabilities. Hassan, she said, turning to face him with newfound directness. "You asked about second chances. Here's what I've learned. Second chances aren't about going back to who we were. They're about discovering who we can still become." Hassan's expression shifted from nostalgic hope to something deeper, respect for the woman standing before him, not the memory he'd been carrying. "And Maria," Amna continued, "assisted living isn't wrong for everyone our age. But it's not right for me, not yet, and maybe not ever. I'm not the same person who was struggling with her balance 3 months ago. I'm not asking you to stop caring about my safety. I'm asking you to see that I've learned how to care for it myself, in ways that make me stronger rather than more dependent." The room fell silent as both Maria and Hassan absorbed what they had witnessed. This wasn't just about exercise or physical fitness. This was about a woman who had refused to accept decline as inevitable, who had found a way to age not just gracefully, but powerfully. "Now," Amna said with a smile that held both tenderness and determination, "who wants to learn these 5 exercises that changed everything?" What followed was perhaps the most beautiful hour Amna had experienced since Ahmed's passing. Maria, initially hesitant, found herself laughing as she attempted the gentle wall push-ups alongside her mother. Hassan, with the careful movements of someone rediscovering his own body's capabilities, joined them in the modified squats and balance exercises. The living room that had been heavy with tension transformed into a space of shared discovery and gentle encouragement. "I can't believe how much harder this is than it looks," Maria admitted, slightly breathless after the arm circles. "But also how possible it feels." That word, possible, captured exactly what Amna had been trying to share. These weren't exercises designed to turn back time or pretend that 74 was 40. They were movements that honored the reality of aging while refusing to surrender to its limitations. Each gentle squat was an act of senior resilience. Every careful balance held a quiet victory over the assumption that decline was inevitable. Hassan, resting against the wall after their routine, looked at Amna with an expression she recognized from their university days, the same wonder he'd shown when she'd solved a particularly challenging math problem. "You found something remarkable here, Amna. Not just the exercises, but the approach to living." As they sat together, sharing tea and the comfortable exhaustion that comes from gentle movement, Maria reached for her mother's hand. "Mama, I owe you an apology. I was so focused on protecting you from falling that I didn't see you were actually learning how to stand stronger." The conversation that followed was filled with the kind of honest sharing that often takes decades to achieve. Maria spoke about her own fears of aging, her terror of watching her mother diminish the way she'd seen happen to so many women of Amna's generation. Hassan shared his journey through his own health challenges, the way loneliness had made him forget that he was still capable of growth and connection. But it was Amna who offered the insight that would stay with all of them long after that afternoon ended. "The timeless lessons aren't about staying young," she said, watching the afternoon light shift across Ahmed's empty chair. "They're about staying present. When I stopped fighting my age and started working with it, everything changed. These exercises didn't make me 20 again. They made me the strongest version of 74 that I could be." 3 weeks later, Maria called with news that surprised no one who had witnessed that Saturday afternoon. She had signed up for her own gentle fitness class and was planning to bring her teenage daughter along. "I realized," she told her mother, "that I want to model aging differently for my own children. I want them to see that growing older could be about gaining strength, not just losing it." Hassan had become a regular part of their small community, not as a romantic rekindling, but as a friend who understood the particular courage required to build a new life chapter after 60. He and Amna took their evening walks with Asifa, 3 people who had discovered that the best years might not be behind them after all. But perhaps the most profound change was in Amna herself. The woman who had once worried about her daughter's phone calls now looked forward to them. The person who had felt apologetic about taking up space now moved through the world with quiet confidence. She had learned that dignity in aging wasn't about gracefully accepting limitations. It was about thoughtfully choosing which battles were worth fighting and which assumptions were worth challenging. On quiet mornings, As she performed her 5 simple exercises in the golden light of her kitchen, Amna sometimes felt Ahmed's presence in the room. Not as sadness for what was lost, but as gratitude for what remained possible. She had discovered that life's quiet victories often come not from dramatic moments, but from the daily choice to show up for yourself with the same tenderness you would offer a dear friend. At 74, Amna had learned the most important lesson of all. It's never too late to become who you were meant to be. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of something in your own life, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Nkaf Wisdomy World. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your wisdom and stories matter. Join us every week as we explore life after 60, emotional strength, and the quiet power of aging with grace. Nkaf Wisdomy World, because every chapter after 60 still holds meaning.